Welcome. This is Jen Julius, and in this interview with Dr. David Sowerby, we're going to be discussing intuition, how to develop your intuition, how to embrace your intuition, and how to utilize your intuition for personal growth. Enjoy.
So you are on air, David. How are you this morning?
I'm good. How are you, Jen?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Thanks for showing up.
Yeah, I thought I would.
Makes my life a little bit easier.
I thought about your heart pounding as I was driving here.
Were you?
Slipping in at the last minute.
Yeah, that's right. That's kind of our style, though. We both do that. We like to push our limits, but we trust our intuition. We know we'll make it, right?
No problem.
So tell me, for the listeners, I've announced you a lot, but I want you to just share a little bit about where you are in the community. So you work at Sonoma State. What else?
Yeah, so I teach psychology at Sonoma State University and Dominican University in San Rafael, and I have a consulting practice, and I work in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also do some writing. I just finished publishing a book on intuition, dreams, and healing.
It's a good book.
Thank you. And Jennifer, you're a very important part of that book.
Thank you.
I asked Jennifer to edit the book, and she did a fantastic job. So thank you, Jen.
Absolutely.
And besides all that, my family keeps me busy. I have a couple of small children who stretch me as far as one can be stretched, but there's probably more in the future. Anyhow.
More stretching or more kids?
Oh, I don't know. No more kids.
Okay.
My kids are wonderful, but
you have enough of them?
They're enough. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. And so we're here, and I was hoping to just share a little bit with our listeners about intuition. What does that mean? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do we understand it? So if you want to jump in and start sharing your thoughts on that, I'd just love to go for it.
So intuition is a very broad topic, and I'm just going to try and define it briefly. There's a lot of different approaches to it out there, but to make it nice and simple, intuition is a state, and it's a state of recognition. So we recognize what is true and what is familiar to us. And another way of understanding this is that we know something immediately. And so there's no, using of the rational mind. And we know something, and we have a tremendous sense of certainty that the information that we are focusing on is correct. So that's one of the key differences between the rational mind, which is often wondering and guessing. And if you're in a state of intuitive knowing or recognition, all doubt vanishes from the mind. And so there's a lot of other ways of understanding this, but I'll make it nice and simple. I'll just add one more definition to this. And intuition really is our deep inner wisdom that we can access through different states of consciousness. And some people believe, and I do as well, that if we are touching our intuition, we are touching our own soul. Mm-hmm. So intuition might be termed, knowing through the capacity of the soul.
Wow. That's deep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I did my best.
No, and that's one of the things that came up for me is the concept of deep inner wisdom, and that I think you mentioned, or maybe it's one of the forms that we'll talk about of direct knowing, right? Is that their term?
Yeah, direct knowing, or sometimes immediate knowing, is a little different. Direct knowing is a type of intuition where there's no form to it. So intuition has many different faces or forms. Some people, for example, experience intuition as that gut feeling. That's probably the most common expression that you hear.
Absolutely.
But that's a kind of a physical sense in the body, very specific part of the body. But many people experience it very differently. Some people experience intuition as a thought that may spontaneously enter the mind unexpectedly. Other people experience it as a strong, compelling emotion. And other people may experience it, for example, as a movement of the body, which would be very spontaneous. There are other forms as well, but direct knowing means that there is no form. This is actually very difficult to put into words, but people will commonly use the kind of phrasing. They will say, I just know. And when I interviewed people quite some time ago who were experts in the field of intuition, when I asked about, how they accessed their information, what form it came to them in, many of them just said, I just know. And when I asked them, did it come as a thought or as an emotion or as a body sensation, etc., they said, no, there was no form whatsoever. So
interesting.
My understanding is direct knowing basically means that it is the purest form of intuition because there's no translation that is done. So that's the way I understand it. And I do experience this myself as well. I experience different forms of it and also the direct knowing.
Interesting. And I'm wondering, it makes me think of, I've been pretty in touch. I was really fortunate to be raised in a family where intuition was talked about and accepted. My dad would sometimes get mad at her and say, you gotta quit making crap happen all the time. Because if she'd get mad and say something, then it would happen. I remember one time she's like, you need to clean the yard. And Dad was watching TV. And he's like, I will. I'm going to watch the show. All of a sudden the electricity goes out. You ain't watching your show no more, are you? That kind of weird stuff. So it was always, she's like, careful, Jen, we can make things happen. And, that's a little bit different than I think intuition, but it was still the concept of being in touch with kind of your spiritual power in a way, because I see intuition being connected to that. And it reminds me of when I was 18 and I just moved to San Diego and I was driving home from work, and I usually took the back roads home, but that day I decided to take the freeway, and I had the clearest, loudest voice come in and start yelling at me. Why are you taking the freeway home? You're an idiot. You never take the freeway home. Don't do it today. I said, shut up, little voice. I'm going to do it. Sure as heck, I got in a 9-car pileup. I was the only car that couldn't drive away. So I just got in a new car, just moved to San Diego, and my car was totaled. And that really, really reinforced, you got to listen to that voice, especially when it's so clear. Exactly.
I think it happens to most of us. It's happened to me and many people I've talked to over the years that we sometimes notice intuition. It speaks to us very clearly and sometimes very loudly and intensely. And often we pass it off or dismiss it. But once we start to pay attention to it and we notice that the information that we receive is helpful, it's practical, it's relevant, and we start to take it more seriously and find ourselves being guided in very direct ways. So I'm glad you learned your lesson, even it was the hard way. But you're not alone. It's very common for people to talk like stories like that are very, very common.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just such an interesting example of something so tangible. That's probably one of my most tangible stories of intuition. I could give other examples that are a little bit more fluffy, but I mean, that one was so clear and loud and direct that it just kind of started to solidify my need to stay tuned into that.
Well, I think that's one of the most satisfying things about this whole area for me is that intuition is a very abstract and, kind of intangible idea.
Right.
And yet, if we listen to it, it can lead to very practical, fruitful outcomes. And that's where the satisfaction comes, that if we follow it and we get a good result, then it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
And, we continue to listen, and then I think life becomes a lot easier. We get into the flow easier when we're paying attention to our intuition, and sometimes we lose touch with it, and life becomes a struggle. But it's possible again to kind of recenter ourselves, go back inside. And this is not so easy to do because we live in a world where there's a lot of external pulls and distractions, etc. So I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening around us, as well as the inner promptings of the soul, if you will.
Absolutely, and trusting. I don't know. For some reason, that's coming to mind a lot. Just trusting those things.
The interesting thing about trust for me is that it's trust that is, how can I put this? Founded upon something. If you're just trusting something without any proof, then you're just being kind of superstitious. So,
interesting.
I think for me, as a general rule, the idea of trust and faith and confidence comes from repeated, results and, proof, essentially. So once we have enough evidence, this is kind of the scientific terminology that I am familiar with. If you have enough proof, after a while, you're convinced. So in the beginning, when people start to pay attention to their intuition, often there's a lot of uncertainty around it. People not quite clear, was that intuition or was that my my wishful thinking. And after we study ourselves carefully over a period of time, we begin to be able to discern what is intuition and what was our wishful thought, or whatever the case may be.
And I really appreciate, especially for people that perhaps are coming from a more scientific background, or are coming from really not being familiar with the concepts that we're discussing, of one of my favorite things about your background is that you do have the scientific background as well as the psychological background. And, besides doing your dissertation on intuition, you also, wasn't your undergrad, I want to say, in engineering?
Oh, that was a long time ago. I began in engineering, and I studied that for a couple of years, and then I studied physics for a year.
Physics, okay.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in science, and then I transferred into psychology. So
got it. But what a beautiful kind of marriage, I think, of two different fields that are actually sometimes a lot more interrelated than people may realize. And I think that, like you said, having continued proof and evidence of intuition is kind of how I love your analogy with how to trust it then. We're not just saying, hey, go out on a whim and trust all the stuff that we're saying. It's no, play around, figure out yourself, honor yourself, like we were speaking about earlier, and go from there.
Well, one thing I'd like to say is that this may sound a bit odd to some of the listeners
we like odd stuff,
who are considered to be scientific. I like kind of going against the grain a little bit.
Hey, so do Bossy and Bessie. Hold on. Whoa, wait. Oh, they were really upset about what I just said about them. Sorry, they didn't let me tell you. They
I
go
used
against
to
the
have
grain.
those things as a kid.
No, you didn't. Really?
I did, yeah.
You can buy them if you want to support Cal's Radio. You can have them again, David.
I'll pull them out in class.
That's right.
Anyway, a lot of people who are scientific do not believe in intuition. And I think that the way I understand it is that intuition and science do go hand in hand, because people that are making discoveries not only in science but in all fields, whether they be in business, literature, music, etc., the moments of discovery or understanding something new, those are moments of intuition or receiving information. And the scientific part of it is where you follow up and test it out to see if it holds water. So the interesting thing is that my observation over the years is that great musicians and scientists and people who have been on the cutting edge of all different fields have used their intuition, not necessarily called it that, but the hard work eventually pays off when you have that moment of discovery. It's very, very satisfying. It's the aha moment, the eureka moment where you finally make your breakthrough. So there's a lot of hard work typically that goes into the process until that moment arrives. But once you get the new insight or the new discovery, you do need to follow up to make sure that it is practical and that it works. And that's the scientific part of collecting the proof or the data. So sometimes people consider in scientific circles intuition as more of a hypothesis, that you get this great idea, but you got to find out if it works. So I see intuition and science as so intertwined. I really don't think they should be separated.
Right. And I'm thinking about, as I said, being raised in an environment where that intuition was already honored and appreciated and kind of like just talked about as something that's somewhat normal, maybe not as formally and in depth as we're discussing in the different forms. But it also makes me think that even someone that believes in intuition and understands it to somewhat of a degree, still I question myself a lot, because it's like, oh, Jen's got one of her feelings again. But it's been interesting because I can honestly say that I think so much of how I was able, not only how I was able to build my business, but also how fast I was able to build my business was directly related to how often and how well I honored the intuitive feelings and thoughts that I was receiving.
That's wonderful. A couple of things I want to say. First of all, in many families, people of strong intuitive ability as children are not honored, and sometimes their experiences are dismissed out of hand, and I think that's a tremendous shame and disservice to the child. And the interesting thing about this for me is that I think that when we come into this world, we are naturally intuitive. I understand we're coming from the other side, which is the spiritual realm, and we bring that intuitive ability with us, but very quickly we get molded by the world around us to become mesmerized by the physical world, and sometimes we lose touch with our inner wisdom and our inner promptings. And the interesting thing about this is that I became interested in intuition a long, long time ago, and I started to gradually over the years meet people who were incredibly successful in their various walks of life, physicians, people in business, people in sports. And the interesting thing is, they would say, and I asked them, how is it that you're so good at this? And they would say intuition.
Wow.
And that really surprised me years ago. Now it doesn't surprise me at all. It makes perfect sense to me. So the interesting thing is that when I hear that your business, kind of took off quickly, I think that makes a whole lot of sense to me, because I know you pretty well, and you really do pay attention to your intuition. It is tricky sometimes too. I heard what you said a moment ago about, we second guess ourselves. Let's face it, when we're in normal waking consciousness, there's a lot of guesswork involved, a lot of mystery in life. And one reason why I became interested in intuition, I love, probably like many other people, I love that feeling of certainty. I love to know for sure.
Right.
And the intuitive moments are those moments of clarity and certainty, and they punctuate all the moments of kind of groping around in the dark, so to speak, floundering around. And to me, that's why intuition can be so valuable. It's almost like amidst the darkness, you do have this light that can guide you, and it will guide you more consistently the more you listen to it and pay attention to it, and develop a relationship with it. It's like developing a relationship with your own soul, your own inner guide.
And for some reason, as you were speaking, it brought me back to what you mentioned earlier, which is the concept of flow. And it just made me think of, in February, I was still working full time, and I decided it was a hard decision, but I decided to leave my full-time job. And the day that I made the energetic choice, that I really finally listened and felt and honored the feeling that I was having about that choice, I made the decision consciously, in as far as my energetic side, that night, but I hadn't actually given notice. But within a few days, I think within 5 days, I had 3 incredible opportunities land on my doorstep. One of them being hosting coffee talks at Coffee Cats in Sebastopol, which is the first and fourth Wednesdays of the month. I keep forgetting to announce that, so there that is. And then also, I believe that the radio show landed in my lap. And then there was one other thing that I forget exactly what it was, but it was just mind-blowing that when I honored that feeling and made just the conscious choice, how everything went, okay, fine, now we can finally line up for you. And it was such an incredible example of what I understood as flow, and just being in alignment with what I'm supposed to be doing in my purpose.
That's a fantastic story. I love to hear stories like that. They're very inspiring, and they do require that leap of faith.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that a lot. And the interesting thing for me is that the irony, at least, is that it's not really a leap. Once you become attuned to that feeling that you get,
right?
And you make a decision that gutsy, to quit a full-time job, people around you may say, "Are you crazy? This doesn't make any sense." But they're not experiencing what you're experiencing, and the message may be so clear. In fact, this happened to me, a very similar experience, that I had. A job I'd worked at for quite some time. And then I had 5 nights in a row, I had 5 clear dreams that told me to quit outright.
Wow.
And that was not easy for me to do, because I'm a very practical person. You can ask my wife this. We had some discussions about this. She may even be listening right now. Anyway, she may get a chuckle out of this. But the interesting thing is, it's not really, in keeping with my practical nature to go out and just quit something that's so, kind of known. And yet the messages were so clear and compelling in my dreams to quit. I finally, after the 5th dream, I decided I need to do this, and I just quit. I did not have anything lined up. And then literally the next day, a job offer came my way, a much better one, by the way.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. It's not a leap that you make without some history, without some, conviction, so to speak. Had I not had experience working with my dreams and the consistent, proof of their wisdom, I'm not sure I would have quit my job quite so readily, but I had learned to hang my hat on this inner wisdom, and now I trust it even more than my rational mind, because it's a different state of consciousness. It would be comparing, for example, looking at something and seeing something as very fuzzy, and then in the next moment, all of a sudden, everything becomes very sharp and acute. It's like looking through a pair of lenses, and all of a sudden everything becomes crystal clear. That's the intuitive state, the clarity. Whereas the fuzzy state was the conscious mind, where it entertains all these possibilities and you don't know what's going to happen. Now, this is the typical scientific attitude. You basically try to remain neutral. You say, I don't know what's going to happen. But the intuitive part of us says, I do know. And it's a state of knowing. It's not a guess. That's the interesting thing, is when the more people are accustomed to listening to their intuition, they realize it's not guesswork, and it's not, fluffy, so to speak. It's actually more solid and a more clear state of consciousness than the waking state. But it must be experienced to be understood. A lot of people question intuition when they hear about it, and they say, I don't know what you're talking about. And unless you start to experience it consistently, you won't know that great feeling of confidence that it really gives you.
I just get so
it's
wrapped up. Yeah. And it brings me back on, before you got here, I was speaking a little bit about what I do in the connection between the emotional, spiritual, and physical systems. And I feel like intuition is also kind of an example of, or not an example perhaps, but how intuition can be felt in all those different realms as well. How you might have a certain emotion or feeling, like you said earlier, that comes through really strongly. I tend to be a feeling kind of person. Also, I have a little bit of somaticism, so I might feel something in my body, and then also from the spiritual component, I'm wondering if you wanted to touch a little bit on developing intuition, because I know that one of the things that you teach a lot is developing intuition, making it stronger. If you wanted to speak to that for a few moments.
Well, first of all, I'll just touch upon the spiritual part and then go into the development.
Perfect.
So,
great.
My understanding is that when you contact your soul, that is the essence of who you are, and that is the spiritual level of your being, so to speak. And so if we get in touch with our intuition, we really are getting in touch with the spiritual realm, which is I understand to be a transcendent realm. It's a higher state of consciousness. So that's how I understand intuition as a general rule. And then in terms of developing intuition, there are all kinds of things that we can do. This is a kind of a broad topic, but I think I'll just mention a couple of things briefly. So the first thing that I would say is that if we're going to develop our intuition, we need to learn how to recognize it when it shows up. This was something that I figured out a long time ago, that intuition can be easily kind of mistaken for something else. So if we think we're having an intuitive moment, we really need to pay attention to it. And I always recommend writing it down or recording it somehow so you capture the details of it, which is really important in understanding the nuance of intuition. And then once we have the experience, we need to learn how to interpret it. And that is sometimes challenging, because sometimes intuition comes to us as a literal experience, and sometimes it comes as a symbol. And if it comes as a symbol, which is very common in dreams, for example, then you have to learn how to interpret it, and this is where we can make some mistakes. So we need to learn how to recognize our own intuitive signature. That's the way I would put it. That everyone's intuition shows up in a slightly different way. There are certainly overlaps between the way different individuals experience it, but we need to learn how to recognize our own intuitive signals, and then learn how to interpret it, and then apply it. And once we start to apply it, it's almost like the circuit is complete then. The intuition starts to happen more regularly when we start to put it into practice. So the more we put it into practice, interestingly enough, the more intuition comes to us after that. So that's one of the first things. I'm
just kind of giggling because it's so true. The more that I've honored it, the more it's increased, and the more clarity that I would get around it. And the more I would trust it, the more it would come through, exactly like you said.
That's right. So in the beginning, for example, when I was first trying to figure out what my intuition looked like, I made a key mistake, and I had made an assumption that when I was having a very strong emotional experience, I thought that was my intuition speaking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, for me, when I found out the result of that, almost invariably I was incorrect. So for me, the strong emotion was clouding my consciousness.
Interesting.
Where I know other individuals, and maybe you fall into this category, I interviewed a very close friend of mine who was profoundly intuitive, and he was one of my mentors, and that was the primary way his intuition showed up, as a strong feeling. He was a very emotional person. His heart was wide open.
Wow.
And that's the way it came to him. So it took me a little while to realize that for me, my intuition showed up often as a thought that would pop into my mind kind of unexpectedly. But what came along with that was also typically a strong bodily sense. And this is what I call my tingling sensation. It starts at the top of my head, and it feels like waves of energy that sometimes descends down through my whole body. And a lot of other people have described this that I've interviewed, and also it's in the research literature on intuition. But the interesting thing then was that I realized that was my most, in the beginning at least, that was my most reliable signal, was the combination of the spontaneous thought combined with the physical response, the energy moving through the body. And so that became the thing that I could hang my hat on. Whenever that happened, I realized that the outcome was always correct. It was always helpful.
Interesting.
So the bottom line basically was that after I studied myself a little bit and I began to write down what I thought were intuitive experiences, and then I looked at the outcome, I went back to the original recording that I did and was able to look in there and find the details of what my intuition actually looked like, the signal and the form of it. So that didn't happen. It didn't take very long, but I needed to really have a careful look at myself, and that's where the scientific part of it comes in, where you observe yourself over a period of time, you look at the data, and you see what pattern emerges. So it was interesting that I was a little surprised by that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, and one of the things that I'm wondering is the title of this show, the Jen Julius show, is Inspiration and Information. And I'm kind of, as you were talking, it kind of made me think of, I just had launched a series a few weeks ago called Happy, Healthy, and Hot. And all the information for that workshop series came from complete inspired thought one night. And over 2 nights, I was up to 1 a.m, putting it together, creating my flyers, blah, blah, blah. And so I almost feel like sometimes intuition, as we were talking, comes in the form of thought, which a lot of people might then correlate with inspired thought. And I really believe, and actually a lot of this might be more of a common understanding, is the importance of working from inspired action and how that also really contributes to the sense of flow, right? So I'm wondering, do you see intuition as also a form that may come through as what someone might interpret as very clear and sporadic inspiration?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that.
Okay.
To me, when people talk about being inspired,
right,
to me that's synonymous with being intuitive. Those moments of inspiration are the intuitive moments.
Got it.
And they are, as I would put it, altered states of consciousness. Sometimes the altered state is profound, and sometimes it's just a slight difference from the previous state, but it is a change from the previous moment. So those inspired, and sometimes those inspired moments, so to speak, last a little more than a moment.
Yeah.
You could get into the flow or the zone, and it could last 5 minutes, it could last an hour. It depends what you're doing.
It's all about being in it goes back to the concept of flow, as we spoke about, and then it goes back to what I think you mentioned something earlier about athletes, and how athletes can really just be in flow for the duration of perhaps an entire game, and just being so in tune and ready and connected to being present. And I think that now I'm kind of creating it full circle in a way, in my mind at least, of intuition being synonymous with inspiration, and my very clear belief and practice of working from inspired action and encouraging others to do so too, and how that actually then creates a sense of flow.
Absolutely. And this has been studied extensively in sports. And
wow.
Actually, that's how my intuition showed up originally, early on in my life,
wow.
in different sports that I played. And one of the other things to connect some of this together that we can do to increase our chances of having intuitive experiences would be to be so focused in the moment, what Maslow called the matter at hand. Mm-hmm. So you're so focused on what you're doing or who you're with or whatever your activity is, mm-hmm. that you become one with it.
Right.
And that actually is the primary characteristic of intuition. It's a state of oneness, and it could be a state of oneness like within ourselves, between ourselves and others. Even, this may sound a little bit abstract, but literally you become one with a question that you want the answer to. So once that state of oneness occurs, that's when the altered state is produced. That's actually what creates the intuitive state, is the coming together or the synthesis mm-hmm. of the various modalities of human experience. When our thoughts, like our head and our heart, come mm-hmm. together mm-hmm. and our actions are aligned with what we think we should do and it feels right. So when all those different things come together, the intuitive moment is the result of that. It's the byproduct of that. So what we can do wherever we are is if our concentration is on whatever we're doing, we're more likely to have an intuitive moment. So the interesting thing is that athletes have sometimes described this as like a soft concentration. You're not trying too hard. You're kind of you're right in between, right? You're kind of like, you're focused, but you're also relaxed. It's really an interesting paradox. So in a way, you have like one foot in heaven and one on earth.
Wow.
So one is in the intuitive realm and the other is in the physical realm, whatever you're actually doing. So that's what the flow is. The flow, the energy comes down from the higher realms into the body, and that's when the body starts to move spontaneously, especially in the arena of sports.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty much all I have right now, because I'm just thinking and focusing still on the concept of oneness. And I think when Arnold had me on his show a while ago, we touched on that briefly, about Arnold has a show on Friday nights from 7 to 9, Tommy's Holiday Camp. So that's who that is. I see you looking at me funny, like, what are you talking about, Jen?
Who's Arnold?
Yeah, who's Arnold? My alter ego, Arnold. So anyways, but I touched briefly on the concept of oneness and just being so connected to whatever you're doing. And it was kind of a funny example that I gave, but I was talking about different forms of spirituality, and I related it to sometimes even I think a form of spiritual connection can be just being one with, we'll say, nature. People always say, be one with nature, and that's your spiritual practice. Well, I think being one with anything and allowing yourself to be in that space can be exactly what we're talking about. Oneness, flow, create that. I would wonder what the research is on when perhaps accidents or injuries happen in athletics, or perhaps with racing, if certain accidents might happen. I mean, of course, just we can't deal with a bunch of people together, but if maybe there's certain breaks in that sense of oneness too. I don't know.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I'll tell you some of the information that I've read about race car drivers is that when they get into the zone, they do say exactly what you just mentioned a moment ago. They talk about they're not driving their car anymore. They are the car. And that sounds very odd.
No,
but the idea is they literally feel like they are one with their machine. And then they say, they actually say they can feel the road.
Yeah.
So the idea here is consciousness actually expands outside of our own skin and our own body, and we literally start to take on the characteristics of the environment around us.
Okay.
And that's the state of flow that athletes and race car drivers talk about. And then if you're going to get into an accident, I think you described it perfectly. What happens then is there's a break in that state of oneness. Our attention shifts, the flow is interrupted, and our attention may be on one thing, and then we don't see this car coming from the other direction, etc. So we're not, our consciousness is not omnipresent anymore.
Interesting.
I've actually been in this state when I've played different sports where I could actually feel, and this sounds odd, but actually see people behind me.
Right.
Because you're in tune with everything around you, the flow of the game and the players, and you can feel them. And you watch athletes, professional athletes, when they're playing, it is incredible. So that they have eyes in the back of their head.
Right.
And they can, once you get into this state, you can actually sometimes see things happen before they occur, and that's called precognition.
Right.
And so the interesting thing is that there was a book, that was produced quite some time ago by Rhea White. It was called In the Zone. It was about the mystical side of sports. Rhea White and Michael Murphy talked about how many athletes, when they have their peak performances, they have mystical states of consciousness.
Wow.
And they don't often talk about this because people are going to think they're nuts, and
Right.
a lot of people won't understand
It's not common, yeah.
And they do talk about, seeing things happen before they occur, watching things from above.
Right.
But the prominent theme, again, to make it, kind of straightforward, is that they do feel that profound oneness.
Mm-hmm.
And it is incredible. It is really quite awe-inspiring. If you're watching someone, it doesn't matter if it's an athlete or a musician or anyone who's doing something, if the person is in the flow or in
Right.
the zone, it's pretty obvious,
Yeah.
because the performance will be extraordinary.
Wow.
And the person will typically describe it afterwards as almost effortless.
Interesting.
Some effort is obviously being extended, and yet they're not struggling, and they're not trying too hard.
Mm-hmm.
The inspiration is flowing through them, and it's really a wonderful thing to experience, and it's wonderful to watch as well.
Yeah.
And I think when you watch it, it can also put you into an intuitive state.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that an example that you gave of the eyes on the back of your head thing, and how you said, you're like, this might sound a little strange, but an example that I would give to listeners is just think of a time where you could feel someone looking at you. That is such a perfect example of just knowing that, or maybe sensing that someone was getting really close to you behind you, or knowing that someone was staring at you on the street. I feel like that's such a good example too of that kind of consciousness and how it surrounds us. If I see what I'm saying a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, what we're doing is, as I understand it, we're sensing someone else's consciousness, which
Mm-hmm.
is being directed at us, and we're picking it up energetically.
Mm-hmm.
And we can sometimes feel it in our body.
Yeah.
And sometimes we actually we sense it in our mind or in our emotions. And there are different ways of picking that up. But absolutely, that's the case.
And that's probably, now we're kind of speaking a little bit more from an energetic basis. But time flies when you're having fun. We have just a few minutes left. But I want to make a few quick announcements and I want to hear a little bit more about your book and where it can be found. I actually just added, if you go to my website, jenjuliusconsulting.com, and you go to the resource tab, you can find a direct link to Dr. David's Sowerby's book, Intuition and Dreams, How to Realize Your Healing Potential in All Areas of Life. You can find a direct link to purchase the book if you desire, and I'm going to have him describe it a little bit. And if you're really excited about all the intuitive talk that we've been having today, we can also continue the discussion on my Facebook page at facebook.com/Jen Julius Consulting. So this is one of my biggest passions. I love talking about intuition. So if you could describe a little bit about what can someone find in your book if they were to purchase that, because it's amazing. It's a perfect, short, handy read, but I'm not going to go crazy on it. You introduce it.
Well, what happened with this book? I had thought about writing a book quite some time ago, but it wasn't until around 14 years ago where I started to receive very specific dreams that told me to write this particular book that has just recently been published. So I actually received 83 dreams over the past 14 years that told me not only how to write the book, what to write about. They gave me the topic, the actual title of the book, who the audience is, and the audience is a very wide audience, people from all walks of life. My dreams told me to write it in a way that was easy to understand and to make it practical. And so the book essentially, and this was not my original plan, the book is a memoir about my own journey of healing, where I share my experiences of intuition, and I also bring in the research and the writings of other scientists, for example, and spiritual teachers. And so the book is intended to be a model of how we can all access our own divinity, intuitive guidance, and creativity, how to work with dreams, go into higher states of consciousness and experience empowerment, and to realize healing in all areas of our life. So the bottom line basically is that I'm trying to teach readers how to access their own intuition and information and heal themselves. It's something that we can learn to do so we don't rely on other people.
Right.
Because intuition really is about inner wisdom. So I want people to get in touch with that so, they can really, access it when they need to at any time in their life.
Yeah. Can I have you on the show again?
Sure, I'd love to come
Excellent.
back.
I feel like this is it's perfect because my intention was to have a good intro day, but I really would love to dive a little bit more into some of the different forms. We talked about a little bit of direct knowing, aha moments. You mentioned, I believe, precognition for a moment, but there's just so many different ways to tap into and develop. And I would just love to, and I think the listeners might love to hear more too. So hopefully everyone has been listening and enjoying and learning. So is there anything that if you were to just give one tip on embracing and honoring your intuition, what would that be?
This is a very general statement, but whatever we're doing, if we can try to become one with it. So the idea is that if you are having a conversation with someone, rather than trying to compete with the person or win the argument, if you're really trying to, understand the other, to become united with the person, become harmonized with that person, intuition is more likely to occur. So the idea here is that we needn't fight life. We need to accept life and become one with it. It doesn't mean that we become passive, but the idea in general is that we need to understand the flow of energy around us. And then once we understand that, then we actually have the power to redirect the energy.
Yeah.
So the ultimate theme here is to become one with yourself, with others, with the environment around you, and whatever you're doing. It's a very simple idea, but if we're mindful of that, we're much more likely to go into intuitive states. So that's the general suggestion. There's a lot of other ones, but that's in a nutshell.
Yeah. Beautiful. Wow. Thank you for being here.
Well, this was a real treat, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm definitely going to steal you and have you out here more. So this was Dr. David Sowerby. I'm practicing, if you can tell, because I've been saying his name wrong for the last 5 years, and I'm bad with breaking habits. And his book is Intuition and Dreams, How to Realize Your Healing Potential in All Areas of Life. You can go find that on the resources tab of my website, jenjuliusconsulting.com, and purchase that book if you'd like. He is amazing, as I said, lots of knowledge about intuition and a very, very useful, handy book, in my opinion.
Thank you for listening to Inspiration and Information with Jen Julius. And for more information about me, you can go to jenjulius.com. That's JenJulius.com. Or you can check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/JenJuliusCoaching. See you next time.